we're doing something of value and more people will see it. Comments, even better. Do you have any questions lingering from yesterday? Put them in the comments. Perhaps I can even get to it at the top. If not, certainly if you have a question or comment during the class. I try to keep an eye, but it's hard to see while I'm teaching, but I always make time at the end. How are we doing, everybody? It's Sunday. We can still say a good voch, a good week, Shavua Tov. May this be not just a good week, but a great week. We could all use it. I had the privilege today, you can see a little image I shared on Accidental Talmudist. I went out with my son and we delivered a few gift boxes provided by Our Big Kitchen. It's a nice organization, obkla.org, which they were just getting organized to provide packages of healthy snacks and meals for needy people. Things got a little interrupted with the crisis, the COVID-19 crisis, but they kept their work going and just redirected. So now they're sending the care packages to firemen, to first responders, to emergency room personnel at hospitals and other urgent care centers. It's beautiful work that they're doing. And we really felt privileged to be able to deliver some of those care packages to a couple of fire stations in our area. So if you'd like to learn more about organizing this kind of stuff in your area or donating, because of course it's a nonprofit with lots of expenses, that is obkla.org. Very nice organization. All right. We are in Tractate 2 of the Talmud, that is Tractate Shabbos. Now we're at chapter 6, and we're still discussing the first Mishnah. We're doing the Gemaras on the first Mishnah. This chapter is all about what people may wear and have on their person when they go out on Shabbos. We can wear any clothing that we want. We can wear any jewelry that we want biblically. The rabbis decreed that some things we should not wear because human behavior being what it is, we might come to take it off without thinking and then carry it, and then we'd be carrying a burden on Shabbos rather than wearing it, and we would violate the biblical prohibition on carrying on Shabbos. If we carry more than 4 cubits, or if we carry from a private domain into a public domain, or vice versa, and then we would be liable to bring a sin offering. So that's what the rabbis are trying to help us avoid. In this first Mishnah, we opened the discussion by talking about a woman's jewelry. You can wear jewelry, you can wear ornaments. Biblically speaking, in Talmudic times, the rabbis prohibited women from wearing most kinds of jewelry because they were afraid they would either take it off to sort of look at it and show it, discuss it with a friend, and then end up carrying it 4 cubits in the public domain and violate the law of carrying. Or they might have to immerse in a mikveh and they would remove these items, the jewelry or hair ties or various things. And then when they emerge from the mikveh, again have the same issue of carrying or transferring from private to public or vice versa. Today, we're going to talk about slaves. Now, this is slaves in ancient times. And, there was a time in the era of modern slavery, for example, American slavery before the Civil War, when slave owners sought to justify the horrific practice of slave ownership by saying, well, it was in the Bible. You look in the Bible and there are laws of owning slaves. In the five books of Moses, in the Torah, there are laws which regulate slave ownership. So therefore, the Bible justifies slave ownership. And these slave owners in the 16, 17, 1800s sought to justify the practice of slavery by pointing to those laws. Of course, you can take things out of context and try to use it to prove whatever your malicious intent is. But in that case, what you have to understand is at the time that the Torah was given, slavery was just, everywhere. It was a widespread, seemingly normal practice in the ancient world. When God gave the Torah to the Jewish people, he actually put regulations on slavery which had never existed before. And so when a person owned the slave, they could no longer have absolute dominion over that person to do whatever they wanted. Prior to these laws, if a owner killed his slave, it was not murder, right? It was just liquidating property, as it were. The Torah absolutely forbids that. And there were a bunch of limitations that were put on the practice of slavery at that time and which had never existed before. So one thing for us to understand as we discuss some law, we're not really discussing slavery per se. We're going to talk about some laws relating to Shabbos as they pertain to slaves. But just so we understand who and what we're talking about, we need to understand that in ancient times, there were actually two kinds of slave with respect to Torah law. So there was basically the Jewish slave and the non-Jewish slave. So a Jewish slave, remember, these are laws for the Jewish people. So among the Jewish people, it was considered, well, you don't want to turn your fellow member of your tribe into a slave. And in fact, there were only two ways that a Jew could become a slave, either because they were so poor and they just didn't have a way to feed themselves, and they thought it was a better option to sell themselves into slavery, or because a person got into so much trouble they couldn't pay a debt, and then they were forced into slavery. But in either case, if a Jew became a slave, it was a temporary condition. It was not permanent. And after a certain number of years, the slave would go out of slavery. And in fact, at the end of that time, when the slave would be freed, the master couldn't send them out empty-handed. So it's much more similar to what would later be called an indentured servant. It was basically, you would become like a more than full-time employee with a significant loss of freedom, but for a temporary amount of time. And you were really a member of the household, right? This wasn't, field slaves, as it were. There was also the Canaanite slave. So now this would be a non-Jew who became a slave, and this could happen, as was the practice at that time, as a result of war. A person could be captured in a war and become a slave like that, or it could be a resident alien who ended up being impoverished and sold himself into slavery, or was reduced to it. In the case of a Canaanite slave, it was a permanent condition, although there were circumstances where the slave could purchase their freedom. They could go out of slavery. We're not going to be discussing those rules and those conditions now. What's relevant to today is that whether it was a Jewish slave or a non-Jewish slave, in either case, a slave owned by a Jewish owner the Jew, of course, was obligated to observe Shabbos, right? So the Jew cannot work on Shabbos, and his slave is not permitted to work on Shabbos. The reason we make a distinction between the Jewish slave and the non-Jewish slave is because the Jewish slave, in addition, the master can't ask him to do any work on Shabbos. Beyond that, the Jewish slave is responsible for himself and his own obligations. So the master has to give him the day off. If that slave then chooses to do some work for his own benefit, then he's violating Shabbos, and it's on him. The non-Jewish slave, the master can't ask him to do work on Shabbos, and what's more, has to actually prevent the slave from doing any work on Shabbos. The master is actually charged with making sure that the slave doesn't do work on Shabbos. And this is even the case if the slave isn't trying to become a sort of, because what happens with a Canaanite slave, they have a choice. They could go, when they go into slavery, they could choose to remain an idolater and just be a slave of a Jew, or they could, if it was a male, have a circumcision, immersed in a mikvah, and then they have the status of a Canaanite slave in which case they're obligated to do the same mitzvahs, the same commandments that a Jewish woman is obligated to do. Not because a woman is compared to a slave, except insofar as the woman, because she's the primary caregiver for the children, is like the slave in that they don't have control over their time. Because they don't have control over their time, they're not obligated in time-bound positive commandments like praying 3 times a day, right? A woman can't be obligated to do that if she's the primary caregiver for the child, because the child could call and she could, come to miss prayer. Likewise, the slave has to follow the orders of the master, so the slave is not responsible for those time-bound positive commandments in the same way as a Jewish woman. In any case, the point is they can't work on Shabbos. Neither the Jewish slave nor the non-Jewish slave is permitted to work on Shabbos, but in terms of being responsible for not working on Shabbos, the Jewish slave, the master can't give him work, but then he's responsible for himself not to do any work that benefits him. The non-Jewish slave, the master can't give him work to do, and the master has to prevent him from doing work for himself, has to enforce the rest of Shabbos, the rest time of Shabbos. Okay. Now that we understand the sort of basic setup that we're talking about, now we want to understand, well, what can the slave carry on Shabbos? And here what we're really going to be talking about, in the same way that when we were talking about a woman's jewelry yesterday, what would be the motivation of the sages to prohibit that, right, is that she might end up carrying something 4 cubits in the public domain or transferring from domain to domain. In terms of the slave, what we're going to talk about is the seal of slavery. So there were 2 ways in which a slave could come to be walking about with some kind of a visible mark of slavery. Either the master could say, this is your seal of slavery and you must wear it, or the slave might actually want to wear a seal of slavery when they're walking about in public, because it's actually for their protection, right? If the slave was in such a condition, for whatever reason, they're sort of like visibly a foreigner, it's just after a war, for example, a bunch of people have been captured and there's no reason for somebody to be walking around in this town who's of the enemy. The fact that they're, enslaved to, whoever is the owner in this town shows everybody else, you leave that person alone, they enjoy the protection of their owner, they're spoken for, as it were. So it might have been beneficial for the slave to take on a seal of slavery and to sort of identify themselves and separate themselves from the other slaves in town. And we need to understand those 2 distinctions. So the rule is, with regard to the seal of slavery, if it's a metal seal that the master has told the slave to wear on a chain around the neck. So it's almost just like a necklace, and it says, property of, this is so distasteful to the modern ear, but you have to understand, in the old days, there were slaves, and this was actually a kinder, gentler way to be a slave if you had to have a slave 3,000 years ago. So if there's some kind of a necklace with a plate and it says, property of and whoever the name of the master is, so that is something that the slave was not permitted to wear on Shabbos. They could not leave the home property, as it were, wearing that seal. And so you see, 1 day out of 7, if slavery, if it's demeaning to wear the mark of slavery, well, 1 day in 7, they could not wear that mark, right? The master would not be permitted to make them wear it, and the slave was not allowed to wear it. Why? Because the master gave the seal to the slave. If the slave went walking around in public with this metal seal, and somehow that metal seal came off, the necklace, got taken off, it got dropped, it got severed, something went wrong. The slave knows that the master is particular about that seal. He shouldn't, come home and say, I lost it. And if it was no longer able to stay on his neck, so he might come to pick it up and carry it. And we don't want him to carry in the public domain because that is a burden that is prohibited on Shabbos. If the seal that the master gave him is made out of clay, a very cheap substance, so then it's permitted, because if it breaks and it drops, then, the slave doesn't care and the master doesn't care. They're not particular about it, so we're not concerned that the slave will pick up that clay marker and carry it home and violate Shabbos in this way. But if the slave made his own seal, right, because he wanted to distinguish himself as, hey, I belong to this very prominent owner, or my master is Rabbi so-and-so, or my master is this very rich and kind man, or my master's really mean and you don't want to mess with him. For whatever reason, he wanted to be associated with his master, then whether it was made of metal or made of clay, the slave is not permitted to wear that in the public domain. Philosophically speaking, why? For the same reason, since he, the slave, is particular about it, he made it. If he drops it, if it detaches, if it breaks, he will come to pick it up and carry it and thereby violate Shabbos. If the seal is not worn on a necklace, but rather is attached to the slave's clothing, he may not wear the garment that has the seal attached to it. Right? That garment with a seal attached to it doesn't work. He can't go out on Shabbos with the seal attached to his clothing. Why? Let's say that it was attached to a cloak. The master gave him this seal, right? It was attached to the garment. We understand that the master is particular about it, so the slave doesn't want to come home in case something went wrong and it became severed, it was detached, and maybe he lost it, right? So it's not so much that we're worried that he's going to carry the seal that became detached, although that is also a problem. But additionally, if the seal was lost and he was afraid, to sort of face the master when he came home with this cloak that should have the seal on it, but now is missing its seal, so he might remove the cloak, fold it, carry it, and walk in, and now what's he doing? Now he's carrying clothing rather than wearing it, right? And if you don't have an Eruv, if you're not in a courtyard, then carrying clothing on Shabbos is prohibited because you're carrying a burden, you're carrying something, and we're afraid that the slave will come to carry his cloak. As I mentioned yesterday, this is something we still think about, right? If you don't have an Eruv, so an Eruv makes it so that all the properties, all of the part of the town that is within the Eruv, it's like they're all sharing a common courtyard. It's a kind of a legal structure that we make. And so then you can carry within the Eruv. If you're going to a synagogue and you want to bring your prayer shawl with you, your talis, if there's an Eruv, okay, so you can just carry it under your arm, the folded talis. Usually it's in a talis bag, and you can just carry it. But if there's no Eruv, and you want to have your prayer shawl in synagogue, your own prayer shawl rather than borrow one that's at the synagogue, then you would have to wear it to get to the synagogue. Because you can wear the garment and walk on Shabbos, but you can't carry on Shabbos if there is no Eruv. Interestingly, we also have the case of the sages who were associated with the household of the Exilarch, right? So the Exilarch is the governor of the Jews in Babylonia, right? So at this point it's part of the Persian Empire, and there are sages who, I don't know, they're the household sages. They're the sages who do work for the Exilarch, or their academy is associated with the Exilarch. And it actually happened that the sages who were associated with the Exilarch, they were sort of like the more prestigious sages, were marked as sort of members, sage members of the Exilarch's household with seals on their cloaks, right? A special kind of seal that was attached to the cloak of these sages. They also could not wear a cloak with such a seal, the seal of the household of the Exilarch, on their garment. They could not wear a garment with that seal and go out with it on Shabbos, for the same reason that the slave cannot, because they might come to be embarrassed that they lost the seal for whatever reason. It became detached, something went wrong. They're embarrassed about it, so they remove the cloak, fold it, and carry it, and now they would violate Shabbos for that reason. Now, you might think, okay, in the case of a slave, he might make that mistake and take off the garment and carry it and violate Shabbos. But a sage, right, a Talmud Chacham, one of the wise rabbis who are part of that, centuries-long discussion of figuring out what the laws of Torah are, and particularly the Shabbos laws, such a person would forget that it's Shabbos and that he can't carry a folded cloak in the public domain? Do we really need such a decree on the sages as well as on the slaves? Answer, yes. Yes, we do. And we encountered the same teaching way back, I think it was on Shabbos 12, and this was in the early days of the COVID-19 crisis. And we were talking about the fact that, who was it? Was it Rabbi Yehoshua? Well, I can tell you, go all the way back. I'm pretty sure it was on page 12, Shabbos 12. Yes, Rabbi Yishmael ben Elisha. So Rabbi Yishmael ben Elisha, a great, great sage, knew that the reason we don't adjust the wick of the Shabbos lamp, that we don't read by the wick of the Shabbos lamp, that we don't read by the light of a Shabbos lamp, right? Rabbi Yishmael ben Elisha knew perfectly well that the reason we don't read by the light of a Shabbos lamp on Friday night is because we might come to absent-mindedly, while we're reading, adjust the wick. And we don't adjust the wick because then you are either extinguishing or kindling fire, right? You're causing something to burn that wouldn't burn, or something to be extinguished a little sooner that would have been extinguished later. So he said to himself, well, I understand that the reason we don't read is because we might come to adjust the wick, but I'm not going to forget that it's Shabbos and that this is prohibited. I'm a sage. So he went and read, and he was, what was his desire? It was to learn more Torah. What was he reading? He was reading a Sefer of Torah. But he got enmeshed, engrossed in what he was doing, and he mindlessly reached over to the Shabbos lamp and moved it and adjusted the wick, etc. And when he realized what he'd done, he said, how great is the word of the sages, for I, Yishmael ben Elisha, who knew better, read by the light of the lamp and adjusted the wick. And then when the temple will be restored, right, when the third temple is restored in the time of the Messiah, I, Yishmael ben Elisha, will bring a fat sin offering as a sacrifice. And that was an important teaching way back at the beginning of this pandemic, right? Because at that time we were all thinking, do we really need to be locked down? Can't we all just be responsible to social distance and keep ourselves to ourselves and keep the 6-foot distance and don't breathe or sneeze on anybody? And the answer is no, we cannot be trusted. We need the lockdown, because people just tend to mindlessly go where they feel like going, not where their intellectual faculties tell them they should go, or they don't do what they think they should do, they do what they want to do. That's the nature of people. And the sages understood that very well. So even a sage, a top sage in the home, who works in the house of the Exilarch, not a slave at all, but one of the most prominent rabbis in the nation, has the same rule as the uneducated non-Jewish slave in terms of you can't go out with a garment with a seal on it on Shabbos because you might lose the seal, get embarrassed, take off the garment, and come to carry the garment. Okay. Let me see. Attached to clothing, no. Sages of the Exilarch's house, no. And then the last little thing we had was a bell. So for one reason or another, I guess occasionally slaves had a bell around their neck. I guess, run in the old days. I don't know what the situation was. Probably something terrible. But where a person would have to wear a bell around their neck. Could they go out on Shabbos with the bell? No, they could not. That was prohibited on Shabbos for the same reasons that we've talked about. The bell might become detached. They might come to carry it and violate Shabbos. So even if they had to wear this awful bell 6 days a week, on Shabbos, they don't wear the bell. What if somebody had a bell sewn in, woven into their clothes? Now, this is not so much the case of a slave as it is the priests, right? So certainly the high priest had into his garments that he wore in the holy temple, the high priest, basically the holiest person in all Israel, the high priest, the Kohen Gadol, he had bells sewn into his garment. It was an adornment, it was a beautiful thing, and you would hear when the priest was coming, and it really gave honor to the priest. Can you wear a garment with bells sewn into it? Yes. A seal attached to the clothing? No. But the seal was not woven into the clothing. It was attached in some other way. These bells would be woven into the clothing. And Rav Huna, the son of Rav Yehoshua, explains that regarding a bell that's woven into a garment, or any accessory that's woven into the garment, the sages did not issue a decree, right? So even though that you might think, well, in the same way that a bell could become detached and a person might come to pick up the bell and carry it because he doesn't want, to lose that bell, because it's woven into the garment, it seems it's so unlikely that the bell will become detached. So the sages did not issue a decree. We don't worry about it. And that is a permitted garment on Shabbos. That's what I've got for us today. Let me check if you have any questions or comments. What is going on? What is going on here? Was there some, perhaps there were some nasty comments and people were commenting on that. I don't know what it was all about. But Nina, I think, was monitoring comments. So whatever the argument was about seems to be gone now. So I'm not going to worry about it. Okay. Okay, and Lindsay Adams says, I didn't know about the bell in the high priest garment. Yes, and so we just had that, was it a couple weeks ago in the weekly Torah portion, describing, and so the bells that were on the high priest's robe were sort of in the shape of pomegranates. And it was like, or I guess it was a pomegranate and a bell, a pomegranate and a bell. It's described quite at length. And what's fascinating, you could Google this. Some people think, and an archaeologist found a bell on the, around the Kotel, right, around the Temple Mount in Israel, in one of the archaeological digs in that area, and it was a little gold bell. Not a proof, not for sure, but possible. Possible that was one of the little gold bells that came from the robe of the Kohen Gadol. That was used in ancient times. I don't know if they're ever going to be able to prove it or to know for sure, but wouldn't that be amazing that one of these little bells survived, through all these centuries? It would be pretty cool. Okay, that is what I've got for us today. May we all be blessed to grow in wisdom every day. And I think our takeaway, right? Let's sort of review that point that the sages of the household of the Exilarch, so the highest and wisest, most educated, were held to the same principle as the Canaanite slave, who would have no education in Jewish practice at all, and might be even coming into it against their will. But in both cases, right, the sages understand human nature. And human nature is to worry about ourselves and our ego first, and our responsibilities second. And because of that, even when we know what our obligations are and we're determined to fulfill our obligations and to do good, still human nature is just to, to go after, to touch, to reach for, to do what the body wants, right? And so this is the great challenge that we have, we meaning our souls, right? We don't have souls, we are souls. We have bodies. And so when we as souls come into this world, right, we are enslaved and locked into a human body. The human body is the most incredible creation in this world. I mean, God made it, it's incredibly beautiful. But the human body possesses animal drives. And so our whole lives, we're in this tension and wrestling, trying to do what we know is right while the body is pulling for what it simply wants, right? Some people call it the battle between the ego and the superego, or between the id and the superego. Whatever words you want to use, the fact is, this is something we always struggle with. And the more we understand it, the more when we want to make a change in our behavior, when we want to get away from the drives of the body, we have to be very humble and understand what those bodily drives are. And then understand that, just because I want to make a change and I'm determined to make a change doesn't mean that I'm going to be able to make that change. In order to make a behavioral change, we have to get very organized, really set in rules and boundaries and systems for ourselves. And even with all of that, we will probably fail in making a change unless we cry out for help, right, to our Creator in heaven. Anyone who's been in a 12-step program or has friends in it, I myself haven't done that program, but I've been to meetings with friends. And there's such a beautiful sense of truth in those meetings. And people say, I bottomed out. I couldn't fix it, but I cried out for help to a power greater than myself. And that was the beginning of my change. And then they put in the boundaries of going to meetings and having a sponsor and all those things. But that whole system is dependent on saying, I can't do it alone. I need the help of a greater being than myself. And the sages understood and taught the same principle. Okay. And Chuck says, could the metallurgist sample the bell and get you a report that will also tell with near certainty where it was cast? Listen, the archaeologists in Israel, for sure they have access to that. So it may not have been so simple. Even if they knew when it was cast and that it was from the right period, there's no proof that it came from, the garment of the high priest. But I think it's possible. I think it's possible. Okay, my friends, sending you all big love from the West Coast, and may you all grow in wisdom.